My name is Marianne2. I was born in 1927 and I'm a survivor. In the south of Germany in 1931, Hitler had already come into power and there was already a certain amount of anti-Semitism. I was then 4 years old, and I went to a nursery school run by the Catholic sisters, and most of the children, or all of the children, were not Jewish. And I learned then and there that became very conscious of the fact that I was Jewish and different from all these children. And it ended up that I walked out of the nursery school, Catholic nursery school, and left for home. And at 5 years of age, that was a pretty brave thing to do. And then I noticed also that in 1934-35, the children on the side streets of the house where we lived in an apartment building, that the children, some of them hesitated to play with us, and I became aware of the fact that sometimes the parents said no to the children, don't play with her. So I started losing friends then, and my brother, who liked gardening, had helped a gardener, and the gardener told him not to come because he couldn't help him. There were still Jewish children going to secondary schools and colleges and universities, but they were not. They had to be in separate public schools. So I started my first year in grammar school until through my fourth year with a Jewish public school teacher in a one-room class in the town of Pirmasens where we lived, and there were about 50 to 60 children in one classroom, and when he taught one class or two classes together, the other classes had to behave. And I remember sitting in a chair that seated two. You've seen those in some schools adjacent, and we were constantly giggling. And so another girl and I sat in one of those seats, and if we giggled, the Jewish teacher, aware of that there couldn't be any interruption while teaching, would come with his stick, and he'd give it to us with a stick. In most of the cities, starting with Berlin, that Jewish children were no longer going to public schools. There were still Jewish children going to secondary schools and colleges and universities, but they were not. They had to be in separate public schools. I finished my 4 years in the Jewish classroom, and then you had to take an exam to go to secondary school, and so I had like other children, all children, not just non-Jewish children, had to take an exam to be admitted to the secondary school, which at that time you still paid some kind of your parents had to pay for the education. In the secondary school, the girls realized that I wasn't sitting in on the religious classes, and I was by that time, quite a few of the Jewish children my age had been sent out of the country. In my first year in the secondary school for girls, and I sat in the hallway while the girls had religious classes, and they would come out and say, "the Jew," and also during recess they would, nobody would play with me, and so it was not a very comfortable situation. but my father always felt that he should be there for his Jewish congregation, so that he never made any attempt. The children that went to secondary school were mistreated. My two older brothers were going to a secondary school. They were bright boys, and they were regularly beaten up and came home in the years of 34, 35, 36. So now, how did we get out of Germany? Because we had no relatives. And I'll try to make it short. But my second oldest brother, his name's Gerhard, I was going to the secondary school and coming home with a bloody nose every day, and he would fight back. And he and his buddies, a couple of other Jewish boys, had already tried to escape to Africa. How they were going to do that. But the police, my parents and their parents sent the police after them and found them on the highway and brought them back home. But he was adventurous and he was very bright, and we had no relatives whatsoever in the United States. My father wrote to a Jewish organization which was really not allowed by the government anymore, but the government had created a Jewish organization supervised by the Nazis. It's really weird. At any rate, he wrote to this Jewish organization and told them that he was aware that some children were being adopted by families in the United States, and every once in a while a social worker from the United States would come to Germany and pick up some children and escort them to the United States, and that there were already parents waiting for them. Well, my father wrote to them and he said, if it's not too late, and it was sort of maybe in August of 1936, if it's not too late, I have a almost 13-year-old. I would be comfortable sending him. He can take care of himself, which is really true. That's my brother Gerhard. So they made provisions for him, and he came over here without a family assigned to him. So when they got here, there were some families, parents, who came to meet the boat, and if they, came by train, they went home by train. So he got in, but he was in the same train with some families who were going towards Chicago and Indiana. And there's this one of the two boys that this family was going to take, asked them if they were kosher. And they said, no, we don't keep kosher. You know what I mean. And my brother was listening to the conversation, and he said to the boy, if you don't want to go with them, I'll go. Oh, this is in German. And so the boy must have talked to the Bloomberg family from Terre Haute, Indiana, and they started a conversation. I don't know how they conversed, because I don't think my brother knew 10 words of English, but whatever, maybe through somebody else. They liked my brother, and they said, if you want to come with us, it's okay, because we were going to get two, and one of them doesn't want to come with us. So he says, I'll come with you. I mean, that's better being in a home for children, So anyway, Terre Haute, Indiana is where he ended up, and with this very wealthy Jewish family. I would say, I think, millionaires. All this came to an end when, after Kristallnacht, because the one teacher in the Jewish school was arrested and sent to Dachau, the concentration camp. My father was arrested, and so were all the Jewish people over the age of the Jewish men over the age of 16. So on November 9th to 10th, the synagogue, and I'll talk specifically about our synagogue in Pirmasens, was burned to the ground, And my father was called very early on the 10th by a colleague that this was happening all over Germany and that he could expect the police to come and he would most likely be arrested with all the other Jewish men over the age of 16 in Pirmasens. And I remember very distinctly that just before they came, when my father heard that the synagogue was burning to the ground, he, for the first time, was very gentle with us. And usually my father was a little on the rough side. He let my youngest brother, who's a year and a half older than I am, and me go to the top level of the city where we lived. There was a bottom area and a top level, stairs to the top level where the synagogue was located. And so we saw the synagogue that had been burned to the ground. And I walked into the synagogue and thought that maybe I would find something, a book or a prayer shawl to take, but there was nothing to take home. And the two civil dressed civilians, not dressed in Nazi uniform, were there to arrest my father. And my mother told my brother and me that we should go in the basement. Now, I don't know why she wanted us to go in the basement, but she said go in the basement, so we went into the basement. And that was the night of the Kristallnacht. In the morning, when we came down the steps to the level where we lived, we saw the main street was full of shrapnel and broken glasses. The windows where Jewish shops had been invaded, and dealt with. So that was the local situation on Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht, November 9 to 10, as reported by Walter Lynn, formerly of Pirmasens, that the town we came from. Walter Lynn was only 16 years old when arrested. Walter and his family survived and reached the United States after World War II. Walter shared his experiences with Marianne Goldstein, who also lived in Pirmasens until they emigrated to the United States. You know all that. Marianne's father was a rabbi of the congregation and the only synagogue which was burned to the ground. By 1938, the congregation had shrunk from 600 families to 200 families. Most of the young adults had left the country. Now I'm going to read you a new section of what happened on November 10th, the day after the day of the arrests, basically, the night and the morning after. On November 10th, and this is in translation, on November 10th, 1938, we learned that the synagogue was burning. During the previous night, scores of Jews were severely beaten. In Germany, 3,500 Jews were killed as they resisted arrests or shot while attempting to escape. In Pirmasens, 150 Jews were arrested and brought to the Volksgarten, the public garden. Early in the morning, some of the 50 of the prisoners were loaded into a bus and smuggled over the border into France. That same day, the French returned us to Germany. In this group was Walter, the one who wrote this up, is Walter and the rabbi, my father, Rabbi Nullhaus. We were placed against the walls to be shot. During the entire time, the Gestapo escorting us had kept their pistols and revolvers upholsters ready to fire. Finally, at midnight, the 50 were returned to the public garden, joining the other 100 prisoners. Later, we were transported to Ludwigshafen, where all of the Jews from the Palatinate, our region, were being gathered. The prisoners were then loaded into regular railroad cars, and without being told where we were headed, we were on our way to Dachau. No food or liquid had been distributed. Then the train stopped somewhere and the prisoners were forced into cattle cars prepared to the arrival in Dachau. Hundreds of SS troops, bayonet mounted on rifles, surrounded the train. Many unfortunates were severely beaten. Boarding the cattle cars and later jumping resulted in fractures and in inquiries that we were told that were totally untreated. The first night in Dachau, the prisoners were literally thrown into the barracks by the SS, that's the Hitlerjugend, one prisoner on top of several others. The following day we were processed. That is, our clothes were taken away, we were given boiling hot showers, then our hair was shorn off, we were taken away, we were given hot boiling showers, and then our hair was shorn off. We were given our prisoner numbers. Finally, we were assigned to barracks. Your father, as well as my father, were put into barrack number 18, room 3. There were no chairs or tables in the barracks, but they were equipped with running water and a basic toilet facility. I imagine that. Note, Dachau was the original concentration camp. Later ones had no toilet facilities whatsoever. Throughout all these happenings, no food was received. In a separate description, I have the total food and liquid given to the prisoners. The Nazis allowed 10 pennies daily for the prisoners, but in actuality it was much less. Then he has a little post notice here, which was nice. Throughout these ordeals, your dear father, Rabbi Nellhaus, maintained his spirit. The prisoners spent the entire day out in the open. We were marched in military fashion 20 to 30 miles. The use of toilets was permitted only for a brief period on getting up at 4 a.m. in the morning, at noon, and after returning to the barracks in the evening. The prisoners were counted twice daily on getting up and marching to the assembly area, and again at 6 p.m. Attempts to escape resulted in death by shooting, hanging, or being whipped to death. And my father came home, totally upset. And while he was in the concentration camp, he wrote my mother a postcard and said, write to our son in Indiana, maybe they can help. And that started that whole.
Do you have any old, like that postcard, do you have anything left from that time?
Well, I have a letter from our sponsor in the United States. I mean, they were very good people. My father was finally released after 5 or 6 weeks, a lot of the others. Few died during this terrible tragedy. And when he came home, he looked terrible. They gave him back his clothes, but they certainly didn't fit anymore. And he had turned gray, and he was really in very bad shape. Before they were dismissed, all these men, they had to transfer the monies. They had to sign papers saying that all the money that they had in insurance and in banks belongs to the state. And then my mother, through some correspondence, and through my father while he was in concentration camp, that it was possible if a rabbi was engaged and could prove that he was going to be engaged with the congregation in the United States, that he could come without the visa number. They had a very limited visa number that was, you know, rabbis and priests and, you know, Christian ministers, and then maybe some, you know, people in the sciences that they could see would be of use to the United States. So my mother wrote, through somebody who knew English, wrote to my brother's step-parents in Terre Haute, Indiana, and said that if they could make out an affidavit through their congregation that he would be their rabbi, he might have a chance to get out of Germany at this late date. A few months later, the stores closed. Hitler didn't let them out anymore. Believe it or not, there was a United States official in Stuttgart, Germany, who in August 1939, after continually being bugged by my father, "Have you heard? Can we go? Can we come for our medicals before we leave?" He called, and the official at the consul, he was a consul, said to him, "Bring your family to Stuttgart, and they'll have their medical exams, and if everything goes well, I will give them permission to get into the United States." Boat ride over.
Your boat ride from
yes,
Germany,
that's
yeah.
worthwhile.
Yeah, let's
Because
talk about it.
our boat ride over was wonderful. And my brother and I were, you know, we're grown up. He's 12 and I'm 10 or 11. And we ran all over the boat from top to bottom and had wonderful meals. We ate when everybody else was too sick to eat. He and I would go in the dining room and have and eat. And we met an American teacher, a woman, who realized that we didn't know any English. She talked to us, and we said, you know, in a little broken English that we had picked up while we were waiting from January to, you know, to our departure. We had a private teacher maybe once a week for an hour to teach us a little basic English. So she said, "You have to learn English. Every day you go to the movies here in the boat." So she made sure we'd go. That's the way you learn English, when you go to the English pictures of the, you know, the English pictures in the movies. And then my father couldn't be a professional in Terre Haute, Indiana, and he had sent him to a theological seminary in, I think, in Pennsylvania. At any rate, his English wasn't strong enough. He had some English, but no way enough to even teach, you know, youngsters. And so actually my father joined us in Boston, where there were some friends of the sponsor. And the sponsor saw to it that my father found a job in a cotton factory and took English lessons on the side. And that by that time I was 10 or 11, and I was able to babysit. And my brother Martin, next to me in age, stood in front of the most popular movie house selling his newspapers. And he did nicely. And then I got a job babysitting nearby across the street. So after he got finished selling the evening newspaper, he could come over and get me if the rats hadn't eaten me up first. And the Jewish teacher was taken prisoner as well. So there was no Jewish school to go back to, and I wasn't allowed to go back to the German school, the girls' school, secondary school, because all these schools were closed after Crystal Night for the Jewish students. so they had to rely primarily at home study, and most of that was to learn a little English for a lot of kids, or Hebrew, some a little Hebrew. We went to Hebrew school, which my father was teaching at the time. But my mother sent me to the Catholic sister sewing school, and they advised me, and they admitted me, and I learned how to sew. And I learned how to sew, and I also learned how to hide when they told me the Nazi, the SSSR is coming to test that everything is okay here. I could say kosher, but I don't think you know the word kosher.
I understand, yeah.
Okay, all right. So when they would, I forget, they had a way of letting me know that I should go into hiding, and they had machines that they figured they'll never notice that somebody's hiding under there. I mean, I was a little girl. I probably am not much bigger now, but anyway. So I learned how to sew, and I enjoyed it. And I also went to, I'm 11 and 12 years old, so I'm not a baby anymore. And I also went to, but this is before Kristallnacht mostly. Going to after Kristallnacht, they wouldn't take me into the Catholics. This was so, I was 11, going on 12. I also enjoyed, there was something else I did. Oh, I went to the local shop where they taught you, arts and crafts. And I learned how to knit and to crochet. My mother wasn't very handy, and till the day she died, the minute she had a scratch or a button to sew on, or a seam to mend, or something to sew, whatever, I was the one doing it. Even when I started, only 11 and a half, 12 years old. Anyway, I learned how to knit and crochet, and I knitted a beautiful lace tablecloth, which my parents sent to the wife of our sponsor in the United States, to thank them for all they'd done.
That's good.
So that you asked what kept me busy and interested. So
That's excellent.
and the other thing, in 1935, 36, Jewish families could not hire non-Jewish women or girls to work in their household. The women had to be at least 50 years old, 45, 50 years old. And so my mother had to do, it was a big apartment. She had a dining room, a nice dining room. My father's study, a large bedroom with a bath, and then the back rooms were 3 smaller bedrooms. But at one time, we were a family with 4 children. And I started, when I was about 11, I got my own little room. My mother sent me to the Catholic sister sewing school. And they advised me, and they admitted me, and I learned how to sew. And I learned how to sew, and I also learned how to hide when they told me the Nazi, the SSSR is coming to test that everything is okay here. When they would, I forget, they had a way of letting me know that I should go into hiding, and they had machines that they figured they'll never notice that somebody's hiding under there. I mean, I was a little girl. I probably am not much bigger now, but anyway. And I learned how to knit and to crochet. My mother wasn't very handy, and till the day she died, the minute she had a scratch or a button to sew on, or a seam to mend, or something to sew, whatever, I was the one doing it. Even when I started, only 11 and a half, 12 years old. Anyway, I learned how to knit and crochet, and I knitted a beautiful lace tablecloth, which my parents sent to the wife of our sponsor in the United States, to thank them for all they'd done. but all the Jews after Kristallnacht had to register with the local offices and take pictures, and their names were changed. The man's name became Israel, and the woman's name became Sarah. So my mother's name was changed, my name was changed. And it became so that you had to have a special permission to go anywhere after a certain time in the evening. So they had pretty much control over the Jewish population at that point.